Thank you. Welcome to the What It Takes to Get Hired in Private Equity webinar, sponsored by PECXO. I'm your moderator, Jeff DePlanty, with over 20 years of PE experience. I'm currently an operating partner with Will Square Capital, a lower middle market PE fund. Before I introduce our experts, I do want to invite you to submit written questions during the webinar. And in the last 10 minutes of the program, I will select a few for discussion with the panel. With that, I want to introduce our two experts, both top PE recruiting experts, in Lindsay Gazowski and Rob Huxtable, both partners at Falcon.
Well, thanks for having us.
Yeah, so I'm excited to get started. Maybe where we start is, you two obviously deal with PE hiring every day. What trends are you seeing right now in hiring?
Rob, I'll let you kick off with that.
Okay, well, thanks, Jeff. My name is Rob Huxtable. I'm founder and partner with Falcon. And we do roughly 75 retained searches a year for a variety of top quartile private equity firms. And we tend to focus on operating partner as well as portfolio company C-suite roles. And I'm happy to share a lot of insight that Lindsay and I have garnered over the years. So I would say in terms of trends, despite economic sort of headwinds that are being advertised by the media, private equity is generally full speed ahead. Deals are a little bit harder to come by given the financing environment, but as it relates to leadership opportunities and talent, we are seeing no slowdown in the number of C-suite roles for which we're being retained. There's a backdrop of supply and demand happening within private equity where the relentless increase of the number of portfolio companies continues to outstrip the supply of experienced executives with private equity backgrounds. And so for those looking for opportunities, there are no shortage of C-suite roles that we're observing today, but no major trends within that kind of broader backdrop, just business as usual and private equity looking for great talent wherever they can find it.
Yeah, to echo what Rob's saying, and I'm Lindsay Gazowski. I've been working with Falcon for over a decade, and a lot of my work is in CFOs. And I think that one of the things that I have seen, in part because this has been such a strong market over the past couple of years in terms of private equity investment, is that salaries have scaled up somewhat, particularly in, fields like CFO where people had been tamped down for a little bit. And that seems to be leveling off a bit now, the rate of increase, but it's still a very strong market because there's so much private equity investment happening.
What about other kind of non-compensation items? Like what are employers more flexible, working remote? What sort of recent trends are you seeing like right now versus maybe even a year or two ago?
Yeah, so the buckets of compensation that we tend to focus most on are probably pretty self-evident, but they include salary, annual bonus, option grants, and some measure of severance protection. And then depending on the deal, sometimes there's a co-investment opportunity. So trends within that construct, Jeff, to your point, there's a lot more openness to remote work within reason. That's a little sector dependent. Your typical software business might be more open to a remote CEO or CFO than, let's say, their manufacturing counterpart, where a lot of work is being done on the shop floor every single day. We've seen salaries continue to climb across the board. And in terms of, equity grants, those have stayed somewhat consistent.
Yeah.
Around percentages by function. But I think for special candidates, it remains a candidate market where you can, secure yourself a really attractive deal that comes with a lot of expectations, but a very attractive one nonetheless.
Got it. Okay, great. Well, for those that aren't really, maybe been in the role for a while, maybe kind of walk through what it's like working with a recruiter. What would it be like working with Falcon from a candidate perspective?
I think one of the unique things about the executive recruiting space is how the recruiters are hired and paid. And the fact that while we absolutely want to ensure a truly phenomenal candidate experience and make sure that as candidates, people are introduced to opportunities that are going to be places where they can succeed and would be good fits for them. Typically, we're hired by either the private equity fund or the company in question. So working with a recruiter is a really interesting sort of balancing act for the recruiter, because on one hand, we're trying to build a great network, really understand the candidates we have, make sure that we're finding good fits, good placements, et cetera, and make sure we're getting, the best possible deal for the successful candidate. And at the same time, you have to satisfy the mandate for which you've been hired from the company. So working with a recruiter, I think the biggest takeaway from all this is they don't necessarily work for you, even though they want you to be successful. There tend to be a lot of steps in these processes. We want to provide transparency. We want to make sure you're on board. We want to make sure we've answered questions, help you understand this doesn't have to be a one-way street in a recruiting process. But also, we have updates with our clients and make sure that we're providing a good slate of candidates and enough people so they feel like they can make good choices, have some good options, and find the person they feel fits best within the role as well.
Yeah, and Jeff, I'd say we get a lot of feedback from both clients and candidates about recruitment firm behaviors. And I think our industry, recruiting in general, has an opportunity to become less transactional in general.
Yeah.
There's a lot more at stake here than whether or not a position gets filled. But you're going to meet all kinds of firms out there. And as you're dealing with search firms, I'd say, work with them openly, but be guarded about the fact that they have an agenda and they may potentially be interested in more of the transaction associated with your candidacy as opposed to, a bigger picture outcome. Because we only work with private equity firms, we take a little bit of a different approach, which is to try to say, let's make everybody involved, all the stakeholders, become informed buyers of the opportunity. And that means spending just as much time with the candidate, helping them understand the pros and cons of a given role, even if that means we gently coax them out of consideration and part as friends, only to look at the next opportunity together. Because the minute these fits start to become artificially forced or become at all transactional, then the risk of hiring mistakes really mounts. And we all know the pain that causes companies and their investors, but we spend just as much time thinking about that pain that's caused to the executives in question, who might otherwise be really talented, but because they found themselves in the wrong fit, now have a foul ball on their resume to deal with. And that's not fun for anybody.
And Rob frequently says that if we could just ensure that we've taken all the qualified executives and matched them up to the qualified opportunities in the right way, even if it's just moving deck chairs, we would create more value both for the executives and the industry as a whole, because that fit component is so important that for both sides, it makes sense that your leadership style aligns well with what the fund is looking for, what the challenges for that business at any given time, and that everyone can work together in a way that's productive and leverages your specific strengths as an executive. And so that's a critical piece of this, is knowing that there are a lot of really, really talented people who end up as runners up on a number of deals, even though they could have been perfectly successful. There was just someone who was a slightly better fit. And I think that that's worth keeping in mind as you go through these processes, is making sure you're finding the right fit for you to really create those wealth generating opportunities.
And I'll jump in here. Being the number two, while obviously you'd rather be the number one, keeping that great relationship with the recruiter, staying in touch. I know from my personal experience, we've found some great candidates that were number twos in particular search for a different opportunity. And so maintaining that relationship, staying in touch, having the right attitude, I think sometimes does work out. We did get a question kind of on this topic, working with a recruiter. So let's say I'm a great candidate, Falcon hasn't found me yet, or the recruiter that's tied in with the various private equity funds. How do I make myself more known so that recruiters know to touch base with me, or who do I touch base with?
Yep, great question. So visibility is important. Believe me, if you're well qualified and talented, we're desperate to find you on any given mandate. So the more readily available you are to us, the better off. So there's a few approaches there. I think as transactional as it sounds, LinkedIn is still the primary avenue for recruiters and funds and portfolio companies to find leaders. But they can't find you if you haven't populated your profile with the kind of keywords that they're going to be used to searching for. So whether that's industry vernacular around private equity like M&A or EBITDA or value creation or liquidity events or sale processes, or more specific performance, measures and metrics, your resume, your LinkedIn really ought to look like an online resume in terms of the quantified bullets, the substance that lets them believe that this person is serious. The only downside to this is if you're not actively looking, you're going to get so much inbound interest, you may want to turn off your notifications. But that would be one avenue. Another is, proactively sending your background as an FYI to various private equity firms who invest in deals that reflect your sector experience. And you don't even have to say that you're looking for work or on the market, but that you're interested in a longer term relationship. You might be open to board service in the near term. You might be available to help them diligence opportunities where they need some subsector expertise. And you can build some working relationships that way. Lindsay may have some other thoughts as well.
Yeah, I mean, because we're on PrivateEquityCXO, registering for sites like this that would keep you abreast of opportunities that are going to come to the fore. That's another great way to learn about some things. But I think that making sure that you're visible without pinging people so often that they don't think of you when that good opportunity comes up. So if you're sending your resume to the same recruiting firm every 2 weeks, it's not going to help you. But making sure that you're active in the industry, have great quantified metrics on LinkedIn and or your resume, and putting it in front of the right people always helps. A lot of this has to do with a little bit of serendipity that people are seeing it at the right time, but making sure you're networking and staying persistent in your search for the right role matters.
And then beyond recruiters, another avenue is investment bankers.
Yeah.
So it's a good idea to identify bankers that traffic in your area of sector specialty and just let yourself be known to them. You can be of assistance to them in a variety of ways, including potentially giving them different deal ideas, even at a high level. But more importantly, we're often in receipt of resumes from our clients that have been forwarded to them by investment banking firms who are looking to, sort of stay in good favor with various sponsors, in part by sharing, talented backgrounds, if and when they make sense. And those bankers are also going to be, fairly timely in terms of their tie to transactions. And roughly a third of our search work is triggered by newly originated deals. So oftentimes when there's a recapitalization, be it first-time private equity or a secondary buyout, that's the most frequent occasion for a C-suite hire, which adds a little bit more credence to the investment banking networking strategy.
Okay. Maybe while we're talking about recruiting, can you just touch a little bit on the process, a timeline from I'm a recruit, I get a call. What could it look like? What would be typical? What would be on the long end of things? Just maybe lay out some scenarios there, if you would.
Well, apparently we just closed a search in 4 days from initial contact, but that's extremely unlikely for most candidates. But with a general process, a recruiter starts discussing with the company, they get engaged with their research, and a week or so into that process, they start reaching out to potential candidates. From there, typically we have a recruit call. There's going to be some kind of initial screening and often some assessments and then a video. All of that can happen within a week, might be 2 weeks based on schedule, could be longer depending on, time of year and whatever else. But think about that process going through in a couple week, horizon. However, typically firms like ours want to build a group of a couple people that they're going to send along to their client, which can delay things if you're the first person through. Most recruiters, if you're the first person through, are going to tell you that and give you a heads up as to what you can expect. From there, there's often a lot of cooks in the kitchen, a lot of people that you'll have to talk to both at the company itself, if you're not interviewing for the CEO role, and at the private equity fund. Again, use all of those interviews as ways to assess whether these are groups of people you want to work with. But that can take another couple weeks. And the more people that are involved in that process, the longer that takes. Some firms can take a solid month of interviews between the scheduling of them and having to go back and forth. If it's an internal position within the fund, there may be several meetings that you're going through to get an operating partner role or something of that nature, which requires, both formal and informal interviews. And with all that, it can take some time. So the process tends to feel a little bit drawn out. And I think on average, and Rob, correct me on this, that the industry average is upwards of 90 days from the start of search till the person gets placed. Now, not all of that is active candidate time, but it can take sort of longer than anyone would like to or hope to take. We have seen, getting back to the question on trends, some of those processes speeding up over recent years. And I think the advent of everyone going to Zoom interviews and things of that nature has really helped speed up the process, because it's a lot easier to jump on a Zoom call than it is to fly into a place to meet with 4 different people from a private equity fund at once. But that said, we may be saving a week there within a whole process.
And Jeff, I'm going to go rapid fire because it looks like we're accumulating some really great questions and we want to get as many of those answered as possible along with your agenda. So I think in short, it takes a couple weeks to get through the firm's process of screening, deep dive interview, any online assessments. And then you should brace yourself for between 4 to 5, and in some cases 6 weeks to get through the sponsors process. Much of that is dead time based on waiting for other candidates to play catch up, availability for subsequent rounds of interviews. We typically see about 100 days from start to finish in the search, and roughly half that time is navigating candidates through the client end of the spectrum.
Okay, great. Rob, you'd mentioned finding the right opportunity, not picking the wrong opportunity. How do you, in a lot of that is the interaction with the PE firm. How do you diligence the PE firm? If it's a C-suite job at one of the operating companies, how do you diligence the PE firm that you're interviewing with? How do you figure out if that's going to be a good fit for you?
Yeah, let's hit the high points. There's also a great content piece on PrivateEquityCXO.com that people can dig a little bit more deeply into. But I think the most important skill, and if no one hears anything else I say on this one, this is the only point that matters. The most important skill you can have is picking the right deal. We see A players get fired and B players become multimillionaires because of the quality of the deal they selected. That is a multifaceted situation. So we'll touch on a few of the components. And Jeff, to your question, what can be done to diligence them? Number one is sponsor quality and sponsor governance fit. Private equity is a big, broad universe. There are all kinds of firms that take a wide variety of approaches to dealing with and working with management, from downright adversarial all the way over to highly collegial and engaging. At Falcon, we only work with the latter type of funds because that's who we want to affiliate with, and that's where we want to place our executives. but that's difficult to tell. So one way to diligence that is to talk with executives who have been through transactions with other portfolio companies previously owned by that sponsor. So use LinkedIn, find some CEOs or CFOs or whomever the position in question is for you. Look to see who some of the exited portfolio companies of that sponsor are, and reach out to that individual to get some insight. The next piece is, why is the role open? So we see probably two trends, I guess, or two factors as to why a search has originated. One, it's a newly backed private equity firm, and there's a lot of building and creation that needs to be done. So looking in the mirror and making sure you really can and want to do that, because that can be tedious and somewhat painstaking, especially in year one. The other reason a search would be open is due to performance of the company. And I'll say that sponsors are going to be interested in disclosing to you as much as they feel responsible about disclosing, but you'll never get the full picture unless you push really hard. And a common refrain we hear from executives is, oh, I wish I had learned more about that role in my diligence. So the second piece of advice is to diligence that opportunity the way that they're diligencing you, for two reasons. One, it's going to help you vet out the fit. And then secondly, the more you dig in, the more excited they're going to be about you. Now, they may pretend to be frustrated or like, wow, this person's really asking for a lot, but secretly they want high maintenance candidates when it comes to digging in, because they know that's how you'll be on their behalf when you're in the company. And so some examples there are getting on an NDA, asking for a redacted board deck, asking for recent financials, and digging into, if the position is open due to turnover, how many predecessors there might have been as well, because sometimes that's also, some danger that's lurking beneath the surface.
And why those people left if there was more than one. There's a deal that I was working on recently where the company grew so exponentially that they replaced a CFO once, and then the CFO that was placed into there got recruited out for a much larger opportunity, which it'd be nice if everyone stuck around until exit. And I would tell you that if you have the opportunity to stick around to exit, that always looks better on your resume. But you can't fault people for taking advantage of things that could possibly be a better opportunity for them. And so there are some stories where you see two CFOs previously where the story makes sense and you can go from there. In some cases, people are quitting left and right or were fired, repeatedly, and that should raise some more flags. But in either case, you have to really dig in and figure out, is this a group that makes sense for me? And do the stories that they're telling about what's happening here seem justified by what I can get from either, again, the financials, talking to other people, and or things I've heard throughout this process?
And Jeff, there's a strange phenomenon. Even right-minded, logical candidates get caught up in competing for opportunities and find themselves interviewing their way into offers. And that's fine to a point, but what they really should be doing is helping that sponsor become an informed buyer of their services, including the candidate's preferred level of engagement from the sponsor. How much assistance do they want? You don't want to have an alpha dog CEO running a portfolio company for a highly prescriptive private equity firm. And the opposite is also true. So I encourage all candidates to speak from the heart, be transparent, engage sincerely and honestly, because if doing so causes you to be eliminated from a search, you've just saved yourself a potential career derailment, which is very difficult and painful to work your way through.
For sure. Well, I guess maybe on that, in terms of like career progression, when thinking about that, what should candidates keep in mind? Like how long do I need to stay at a job? Like what does that look like in terms of career progression, and how should people be thinking about their career from that perspective?
So if it's your earlier career, you're going to want to focus on stability to a point. 5 to 7 years per company is a comfortable window. It gives you room for a couple, 3 promotions, but it also gives you a chance to move around to a couple different organizations so that you don't enter the private equity market with 25 years from the same business, which is seen as less appealing. Stability matters too, because when they look to bring you on board, your mission for them is to get them to a liquidity event and to be seen by the next buyer, if it's a private equity firm, as someone that's going to take them to a successful liquidity event, or at least a good ways into it. So if you're interviewing with a role that's at the dawn of a hold period, and that sponsor is going to be in that deal for 4 to 5 years, and you've got a jumpy background, the first question they're going to say to themselves is, how can we trust you to stay with us for 5 years if you've only stayed at one place for 5 years your entire career? And candidates can get, sort of bought into this idea, well, I was recruited out, or I made some moves, or, the opportunity presented itself. But at the end of the day, stability to a point, does matter, because they're counting on you to get them to an exit. Anything short of you staying there through a successful liquidity event, is not a win for them.
And I think that a lot of our clients, at least, want to see people that have developed skills and have learned from successful companies earlier in their career. So large blue chips or academy companies in their space. If you're in finance, having done, public accounting or a phenomenal finance development program, some of those things earlier in your career. And then moving into progressively higher levels of experience at companies of progressive size closer to the one for which you're being recruited. This is not to say that everyone needs private equity experience necessarily to be successful in private equity, but they want to see someone who has been in dynamic, flexible, and entrepreneurial environments where you have to make decisions in whether it's a cash constrained space or a rapidly evolving space, or something that has similar transformational challenges to what's at hand. I saw that coming up a lot in the Q&A chat about, do you have to have PE experience? And the answer is no, although it tends to be preferred if that PE experience was successful.
Yep. Well, and then speaking of kind of early history, people that are kind of moving up in their career, getting advanced, getting promoted, how should that candidate, oftentimes they've had success and they get a recruiter call on a really great job, really big job, maybe, skipping a step or two. How do you think about that from a candidate's perspective?
Yeah, I think skipping a step or two is always a dicey proposition. I think Jeff, if you're talking about folks who be coming into private equity for the first time, there's always a whiplash effect experienced by candidates. Everybody thinks they're entrepreneurial, thinks they're hands-on, thinks they have a great sense of urgency and a high velocity of decision-making capacity, comfort with ambiguity, and the list goes on, until they get into the private equity space. And then time and again, there's the experience of, gosh, I was in the fast lane, but this is the Autobahn, and I've got traffic bearing down upon me, and maybe even some tire tread over my back if I'm not careful. So it can be tempting and alluring to make a big jump and skip a step, as you put it. A general rule of thumb, I would say, is if somebody's with a larger company, let's say a division P&L experience of a certain size, you kind of want to go down to be CEO at a rate of maybe 5 to 10 to 1. So if you're running a $300 million division inside of a larger business, it's totally sensible to go run a $150 million down to maybe even a $75 million or even $50 million standalone business as CEO. Because it's going to be harder, it's going to be more comprehensive. You're going to go through an incredibly difficult challenge that many people thrive under, but you don't need to add to your degree of difficulty by reaching too far. If you're going to get into private equity in your 40s, that means you've got 20 years or better of value creation window. That's 3, 4, 5 hold periods, 3, 4, 5 liquidity events. Better to play it smart than be overly liberal, I think, with your decision making.
And I think that if you're trying to go from a lower level title to a top title within your functional area, it's easier to do that if you're staying within the industry or the area of core competency that you've developed over time. It tends to be a little bit harder to say, I'm both a best athlete and I should be jumping up a level. if there's not very clear and explicit reasons for that to happen.
Great. Are there specific candidate traits that sponsors look for in general? Lindsay, I don't know if it's searching for a CFO or, CEO. Are there certain traits that, you found all sponsors are generally kind of looking for that may be a little unique, PE versus non-PE?
Yeah, I mean, the two things that I think, well, probably three, that all sponsors are looking for across the board. They want people who are smart, and smart being able to keep up with the logic and rigor of what's going to be asked for them. But generally speaking, smarter is better unless you come off like a jerk. Two is not being overly arrogant. Confidence is appreciated, arrogance is not. And the third is having a real desire to dig in and get scrappy. These are hard jobs, and the sponsors want someone who's willing to do whatever it takes to ensure victory for the team. Whether that's making sure that you can rally everyone to work extra hard to get something done, or to be able to identify new opportunities in the market, or, just very simply continue day in and day out to do what it takes to make the company successful. That's sort of the core X factor that seems to really appeal to sponsors.
Yeah, the way I think about what Lindsay just said is they all want a white collar brain with a blue collar ability to get things done, wrapped up in the same elusive package. And then, when it comes down to interviewing the traits that they're looking for, I always think there's two bars sponsors are trying to get over. The first is, are we a good fiduciary if we hire this person? Are they well qualified to do a great job in the role? Do they fit? All the usual suspect questions. But then the more elusive bar that some candidates struggle with is the sponsors, whether they ever admit it or not, they're neck deep in challenge and adversity. These are not easy companies to transform. They want help, and they want somebody who's going to come into the trenches with them and get them excited to want to work with that person over a 5-year period. So whatever your X factor emotion is as a candidate, and for my introverts out there, maybe it's intensity or a smoldering competitiveness. For extroverts, maybe it's passion. You've got to find a way to let them feel you during the interview. So you can tell them you're competitive all day long, but if they don't feel your competitive fire, it's just not going to work. Then we'll get a phone call that's very predictable, and it'll sound something like, well, I really like meeting them, but gee, they're just, I don't know. And they'll struggle and then end up landing on not the right fit for what we're trying to achieve. And this is an issue, Jeff, because there's a difference between a good executive and a good candidate.
Yeah.
And finding a way for good executives to at least perform as, solid candidates while still being true to themselves is key. Sometimes I'll hear from an introverted CFO who says, well, if they want someone who's going to pound the table and be a rah-rah person, that's not me. Of course, that's not a constructive take. We're not talking about a binary situation here, but moving people down the continuum to a more relatable way that leaves that sponsor after that interview wishing they had more time, looking forward to getting to know them better, wanting to invite them into the foxhole with them.
Yeah, and I'll just put in my 2 cents here. These hires, the private equity firm is going to work with them for 5, 7, 3, whatever it is, but a good while. And not all times are great times. And from my perspective, I want to hire someone I can work with. To Lindsay's comment about being really arrogant, these positions require some confidence for sure. But I also want to be able to, look forward. I'm going to work with this person for the next 5 years. Can I do that? And a lot of times if you have 2 great candidates, it comes down to personality and who can I work with? What's the right fit there? Rob, you mentioned the interview and how that comes across. What can derail an interview, and how can a great candidate lose a job?
Great question. There are definite patterns here. So in no particular order, brevity. Private equity has short attention span. So they're like the cliched person with the remote control who can't wait to change the channel. The minute you take longer than you should to answer a question, or God forbid, you dovetail one answer with another thought that wasn't what was asked, or if you answer a question that wasn't asked by giving information that's not exactly on point, that's going to be an immediate a problem for them. If you talk at surface level and don't get into real specifics and tangible examples that include metrics and KPIs, that's going to be a problem. If you're not talking systems, processes, tools, and methodologies, which is sort of where that earlier career big company experience tends to benefit candidates, because they've seen what good looks like at scale. They've hopefully learned from a rigorous shop, how to do various things. You may not use those exact tools at the private equity sponsor, but they want to know that you're not a lead by feel person, that you are a systems process oriented person who's going to build a scalable machine, not just rally a great culture. I'll leave some room for Lindsay to finish the answer.
Yeah, I'm going to reiterate one of the early ones. If someone asks you for one example, give one example. Don't give 12. And I think that there are a number of people out there who get nervous and think they need to oversell themselves. And so it's making sure that you just talk about the things you've done and not try to overhype those things or to try to throw someone else under the bus to make yourself look better. Just be transparent, highlight the things you've done, and lead with what you're good at.
Yeah, and to Lindsay's point, if you're asked, tell me about your background or take me through your background, that's a 4 to 7 minute answer. We get calls all the time from sponsors saying, well, I asked that question and 45 minutes later, there was no time for anything else. And Lindsay raises a great point on negativity. On one hand, you want to be transparent and candid about what you've dealt with and experienced, but you want to stop short of blaming or complaining, period, because they want positive, constructive, high energy people who are going to be solutions oriented and not looking to pass the buck on their team. And a great way to shoot yourself in the foot is to pass the buck about your past experience.
And as just a general rule for interviewing, show up on time, be appropriate for the role, treat everyone with respect. All of those just standard being a good human components that you'd think everyone knows, and we see far too often that people come in and just are not behaving as if they respect the time or needs of the other side.
Yeah, Jeff, if we have time, I don't want to violate my own counsel and answer a question that wasn't asked, but there are also some great ideas that should be done proactively that can enrich interview performance.
Okay. What about the most revealing interview questions? Are there great questions that you think candidates should be prepped for? How does a candidate prep for an interview? Like how should they think about that?
So not to push back on the premise, but we would always encourage candidates to approach them as a mutual diligence session as opposed to an interview. So when a candidate calls us after an interview and says, boy, I interviewed really well, I immediately get nervous. Like, okay, that probably didn't go so well, because it meant that they were trying to navigate the questions as opposed to meet them head on. So coming up with your own formula about, brevity, quantified answers, and also a balanced view. And if you are weak in a certain area, there's no better way to build trust than to just take it head on and then maybe offer a mitigating strategy about how you plan to close the loop on that area of weakness in your background. But, handle it as if you were in a board meeting with a collaborative sponsor. You're going to want to answer the questions that were asked in a constructive way. and not try to navigate past anything, because these are sharp people. These are some of the smartest business minds in America, and they will latch on to, for lack of a technical term, BS. And that's the beginning of the end.
And I think the other thing people just should prepare for is know the person you're talking to, look them up. We can all Google. It's important to have some sense of who you're talking to, the business that you're talking to and about, whether that's at the recruiter level or going into the actual business. I'm always shocked when we've walked someone through, here's what business portfolio company X does the following. Here's all the information that we have about this to try to inform you. Person goes through multiple interviews on our end, gets into an interview with the CEO, and basically reveals that they have no idea what the company does. Didn't process any of it, didn't write it down, didn't take notes, didn't prep. The other thing that all of our clients want to see is that someone knows their numbers. If you have something on your resume that you grew a business from X to Y, first of all, know what you put on your resume, but also know how you did it and what the KPIs were behind that and how you would bring similar success to a new organization. These all sound very basic, but it's prep work that I think some people forget they need to do.
Yeah, the art of the executive interview preparation is just eroded over time. And the good news is, for those that do take it seriously and have a more thorough, thoughtful, engaging approach, you can truly stand apart. Simple examples, secret shopping the company you're interviewing with, regardless of what kind of business it is. Just call in and pretending to be a customer, interested in something, and just make some observations, bring that to bear, look up who their competitors are, network in your own community to see who might have some insights. They're so hungry for anything constructive and proactive and thoughtful, because that's the kind of behavior they want to observe, on the job when you're partnered up during the hold period. So don't do it if it's not real for you, but you should feel free to dig in and differentiate yourself with your approach to the interview.
Okay, great. Not all processes have this, but some interview processes do have kind of a final presentation. How should someone prepare for that? What are best practices you're seeing in that sort of environment?
I think I'm seeing more groups go to some kind of final presentation. It's the same as basically with anything else in this process, having a concise, straightforward, logical story behind whatever you're presenting, and doing so in a way that's confident and knowledgeable, and leaves enough time for questions, can be engaged as a true conversation, can help people understand how you present. The point of those, final presentations is really to understand, how do you communicate information, and will you be able to keep your board informed as to what you're doing in a way that feels collaborative. And so it's making sure that you can do that in a way that feels natural, feels, again, confident, and that communicates knowledge about whatever you chose to present. If you don't get to choose the topic, it's providing keen insights where possible based on the information provided, while still communicating information successfully.
Yeah, it's the final opportunity for you to inspire confidence. And that is a phrase that is whispered among our halls at Falcon regularly. You don't have to be inspirational, but the way that you engage and perform needs to inspire confidence in others that you are the right person for this role. And I think the biggest distinction between one of these presentations versus previous interview steps, where a candidate may have done really well, only to then perhaps struggle in the presentation, is now you're having just a business discussion about various situations, some real, some speculative. And, your ability to think on your feet, your ability to process real time, to engage, is almost something that's difficult to prepare for. other than maybe doing some dry runs on your own. If you have some colleagues or friends who are, discriminating executives, ask them to poke holes, in your presentation, poke holes in the way that you're positioning things, because the private equity firm is secretly rooting for you to do really well because they are desperate to get the position filled. And yet they are going to be hyper rigorous about cross-examining you to make sure that they're not hiring the wrong person. So it's this odd dichotomy that unfolds in those presentations.
And I saw in the Q&A that someone noted that they basically can't believe that real executives would be making these mistakes. And in fact, I most often see these things come up when it's someone who has been successful a couple times over, because they assume that what worked for them in the past should be totally fine in the future, or that they don't necessarily need to do the work because they are confident in their own abilities. It's people who are dedicated and want these jobs that tend to do the best in interview processes, so long as they don't overthink themselves and, get in their own heads too much.
So that question has me smiling on the inside, because I don't know if that person is coming from a private equity backed environment, but to me, it suggests that this theme that we're trying to sort of get across, the folks you're dealing with here are some of the brightest, sharpest, most discriminating minds in American business. They process volumes of information quickly. They get to the root of the matter. They are hyper analytical, and they can sense sort of spin like few others. And this is not your typical larger company kind of environment. These are special people. I don't mean to put them on a pedestal as if they're the best business people in America, but they're a very unique breed that creates a bit of a daunting gauntlet during these presentations. So even to the participant's question, I get it. If you're a solid executive, you should be squared away and be able to handle tough, insightful questions. But time and again, I think we are running about 35 to 40% of candidates who are presenting do not proceed to offer because of presentation performance. And these are legit backgrounds with very accomplished individuals in their own right.
And Jeff, we'll put you on a pedestal all day long.
All right, great. I love that. I love that. But to your point, most of the people doing these interviews, that's not what they do all day. They want, in terms of the private equity firm, they want to fill this position. They want to find the candidate. They want the process to be over. We definitely, every day that executive's not in the seat is another day, between now and exit. So we want to fill the role. It's just, obviously getting the right candidate. And before we get to some of the questions at the end, did want to touch a little bit on compensation. What are you seeing in the market for how compensation levels and mix and negotiations stand? Like, is the market moving right now? Just touch on that a bit.
Yeah, my favorite stat that came out of some internal research that we did with a compensation study showed that while expectations for compensation from candidates has risen almost 40% in the last, let's call it 18 months, actual compensation's gone up about 25% over the same period. Still a lot of money. That's in terms of base and bonus put together. But there is a bit of a disconnect between what people say they want and what they're actually willing to take. We are seeing increasing, or have seen increasing salaries, and to a lesser extent, increasing bonuses. The total packages seem to be going up a bit. And I expect that actually to level out this year. The rate of increase is not going up as fast as it was over the last year. We can see how that changes with inflation and with how the macroeconomic trends work. But, I think there are increasing opportunities for great executives to be paid. And at the same time, a lot of that funds would like to see happen in something that's tied to variable compensation and tied to the equity at exit.
Yeah, I would say, Jeff, sponsors expect you to negotiate. In fact, if you don't negotiate, you're almost signaling that you're not tough enough to do the job at the level they want it done. So even if it's a slightly uncomfortable topic for you to broach, you need constructive, thoughtful negotiation. And what I mean by that is it's got to exist within the spirit of the deal. So if you understand the rough company size and what industry it's in and sort of the EBITDA margins, and you can get a feel for what's fair and competitive, try not to reach too far beyond those limits or you'll signal yourself as a hired gun. Be thoughtful about the percentages. One thing that we notice is that candidates are often thoughtful about a counteroffer on salary and maybe offering or asking for a 10% bump off of what was offered. And then they'll forgive me, but lazily ask for a 50% bump on the equity grant, as if those basis points are, just growing on trees and not all that valuable. And that's outside the spirit of the deal and also signals, I think, a lack of sophistication to, the people that you're negotiating with. And then as it relates to equity, one of the trickiest parts for executives is when you get an offer, you're likely going to be presented with some kind of sensitivity analysis that shows how that option grant in equity will perform over the balance of the hold period under certain assumptions of revenue growth and/or add-on activity, margin enhancement. It's your job to almost rebuild that model for yourself and come to your own conclusion as to what you think that option grant is worth and focus on the dollars at exit as opposed to whatever percentage your friend's brother-in-law's sister's boyfriend told you was appropriate for a private equity-backed company.
Yeah, at the end of the day, while there are probably bands that most grants fall within in terms of percentage at any given CXO title, the dollars are what matters. You want to make sure you understand what you're getting into this for and what you're making, because that's a huge part of what these packages are all about.
From my perspective, I do think the people that are thoughtful in their negotiation on the equity get it. And to your point, I don't know, Lindsay or Rob, who made the point, but if you're kind of flippant with the equity ask, it's almost like you don't understand the value. And from my perspective, that's where all the value's at. Salary, we'll figure that out, but all the real value in these roles is in the equity. And so, you just have to act like you understand that and, put the appropriate focus on that.
Yeah,
which, by the way,
go ahead, Lindsay.
Oh, go ahead, Rob.
No, please.
I was going to say, that's part of why people want to see that others have gotten to exit, is because if the real value in these things is in the equity, there has to be a really good reason why you didn't stick around for that enormous part of your package.
And if you are going to counter offer for above market salary, come up with a better reason than you've accumulated a certain lifestyle that requires a certain amount of monthly cash flow. That usually doesn't resonate with our clients.
The other thing that does not resonate is when someone is coming from a slightly different background, whether it's they're coming directly out of public company or they're coming out of venture or they're coming out of, a family office scenario. And they say, well, I've talked to some people and they say that I should be getting 10% in equity. Well, not in this world. And so listening to your recruiter when they walk you through it, most recruiters are paid as a percentage of the package that you get, equity not included, but they want you to get a good deal. They want to help you understand what market's going to be. Having a good and open conversation with your recruiter, as opposed to trying to keep things back to say, well, I'm going to posture to this person, I'm going to posture to this person, and I'm going to try to get the best deal on my own, doesn't necessarily work here, because your recruiter's going to have a lot more information as to what the market actually looks like and what this particular client is willing to pay, specifically if they've worked with the client in the past.
Great. Touching on some of the questions that I see in the dialogue here, several people have questioned moving from a public company to a PE-backed company. Rob, earlier you mentioned, maybe if you've got P&L responsibility moving down in terms of revenue. What other issues items should people in that position, one, be thinking about, and two, what can they do to help make that transition?
I think one of the concerns, Rob's on mute for here, so I'll jump in first, but I think one of the concerns a lot of people have when they're trying to make concerns from the private equity fund side, when people are trying to make the transition from a public company into private equity, is that there are very rarely shared services. There are very rarely some of these larger company safety nets that are there. And so making sure that you know that it really is all on you, and that a lot of times some of the silly requests that you otherwise might be able to shuffle off to somebody else, you're either going to have to train someone to do, or might have to just do yourself. Jump in and get it done. I think the best thing to do in these cases is to listen, to be a sponge, and to try to dig in wherever possible if you're moving from these larger company environments to especially a smaller private equity backed scenario.
Yeah, the biggest fear that the sponsor is going to have about your background are that you're not going to be hands-on. To Lindsay's point, you're used to too many resources. So when they say hands-on, sleeves rolled up, dirt under the fingernails, they really mean it, that you are just willing to do whatever it takes in a pretty resource finite environment that includes, the size of your team and other resources. They're also going to be worried that you won't move fast enough. So the more urgency you can demonstrate and the more capacity for speedy decision-making that, yes, is rooted in analytics and data, but is also in the face of ambiguity, that's a positive. And then this is a huge one, which is that, no matter how complex one of these deals might be, the investment thesis is generally pretty straightforward. They're going to try to increase the strength of the management team. They're going to grow top line. They're going to improve margin profile. They're going to do M&A, add-on acquisitions. They're going to expand the TAM. And so whatever level of sophistication exists within the strategy is sort of finite. And then it's all about execution. And that's all that folks want in private equity. So the whole adage that execution eats strategy for lunch could not be more true in private equity. And as you interview coming out of a larger or public company, making sure that you really focus on that piece is essential.
Thanks. A couple more random ones. One, I thought, I've always wondered this. When you guys are bringing candidates through and finally someone gets hired, what percentage of those have you had a previous experience with? Are you like putting the same recruits into new jobs? Are these generally, new candidates you come up with? Is that even a meaningful number?
I mean, we love to work with the same executives time and again, but it's less than 10% that we're able to repurpose, because when we do our job right, they go into a company, they flourish, that company gets to an exit, often to another private equity firm where they're going to stay and get that second bite of the apple with another exit. But to the extent that it's a strategic buyer where they don't want to stick around and they want to come back to the PE-backed middle market, or if they sell to a sponsor that's got a different point of view and doesn't really fit governance-wise with how they want to work, we always welcome our alumni candidates back with open arms, for sure.
And there's probably about a third of the candidates we've engaged with previously. So, whether they were in another process or had proactive conversations with previously. So it's not to say that, it's all from scratch every time. And I'd like it to be an even higher number than that, but it's just simply trying to find the bandwidth to constantly be talking to people and still do your job is kind of difficult. But yeah, we'd absolutely love to have people that we've talked to before be able to be, I'll call it redeployed into a scenario that's going to fit them better.
Great. One last one. I think, Rob, you mentioned earlier foul balls in your career. And this question is, if you've got a short stint somewhere that didn't work out, should you just leave it out of your LinkedIn profile?
Yeah, you definitely want to leave it in because one way or another, oftentimes vetting is going to find the existence of that role. And I think you just want to take it on for what it is. There will be some sponsors that will penalize you for that, and others that will keep an open mind. I think it's a question of how thoughtful you are about why it didn't work out. And I always tell executives, reach back out to the sponsor that you had the parting of ways with. Get on the same page with them about exactly what they can say in vetting calls that will be both supportive and constructively critical. And then just get aligned with the truth around that balanced message. And I think, that's going to enhance your opportunities to find your way back in. The other plan there, and this is also an avenue for larger company executives who want to break into private equity, find yourself a larger PE-backed deal and get a division P&L role, or because a lot of our CEO and CFO placements are executives who've been the number 2 functional leader in a larger PE-backed deal who are now ready to step up. And those roles that I described earlier oftentimes don't require private equity experience.
Okay, great. Well, I want to be respectful of everyone's time. We've hit the hour now. Lindsay, Rob, certainly appreciate your expertise and comments. Any final words of advice?
It's a beautiful, wild west, wonderful world of private equity. And with the right river guide, you can find a great sponsor that owns a beautiful deal and get a liquidity event that can set you and your family up for a long time. Just be smart, thoughtful, and let's go find these things together.
Yep. And from my end, I'll be a little flippant here, but everyone calls themselves servant leaders. Make sure you can actually define your leadership style in a way that's a little more thoughtful than that.
Got it. All right. Very good. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Jeff, so much.
Appreciate it.
You.